Have you ever known someone the world dismissed at first sight? Someone others laughed at, until life revealed the quiet strength they carried in the rugged Wyoming territory. A woman named Martha Ellen Carter arrived with nothing but her courage and a heart no one thought would matter. Folks in Willow Creek mocked her as the fat bride, whispering behind her back. Yet when 4 abandoned children stood in need of shelter, and a grieving rancher offered little more than silence, Martha faced a choice. Would she shrink under the weight of shame or step into a role no one asked her to fill? Now, imagine it was you. Imagine standing in a town that scorned you, walking into a cabin still haunted by loss, with hungry mouths to feed and cold winds clawing at the windows. Would you have the strength to stay? Could you love children who weren't your own and offer kindness when all you'd known was ridicule? This is the story of how one overlooked woman transformed a lonely ranch into a home. A story of courage, sacrifice, and love that lingers long after the laughter fades. If this stirs something in you, please like, share, and subscribe, because stories like Martha's deserve to be kept alive. Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind swept down from the high ridges with a sharp bite, curling through brittle grass and rattling the warped boards of old porches. The sky carried that heavy pewter tint that signaled the first snow would soon arrive. Along the main street, half mud and half frost, horses stamped impatiently at their posts while townsfolk kept their chins tucked into woolen scarves. She was the last one standing. The other women had already been bid on, some with eagerness, others with despair in their eyes. But this final woman, no one reached for a coin. Her shoulders were broad, her frame rounded, her face weathered by wind yet calm, unshaken. The thin shawl draped across her did little to disguise her fullness. A few men chuckled. One whispered, "Looks like 2 women crammed into a single dress." Another laughed louder. "Best reinforce your bed frame if you buy her." She did not flinch. Her chin stayed high, as though she had already survived far harsher cruelties than idle mockery. The auctioneer, face red and voice hoarse, cleared his throat. Martha Ellen Carter, age 23, hard-working, obedient, skilled with both needle and skillet. $1. Do I hear one silence? Only a few snorts of laughter. A man tossed a broken button into the dirt, shouting, "That's all she's worth." But then a voice came steady from the edge of the street. Not loud, not mocking. 2. Heads turned. It was the tall rancher few remembered well. Silas McGraw, who lived beyond the ridge near the creek that gave Willow Creek its name. He seldom came to town except for nails or tobacco, always in the same worn coat, rarely meeting anyone's gaze. The auctioneer blinked. Well then, sold. No one else bid. Martha stepped down. Her boots sank into the mud. She did not look back at the jeering crowd or smile at the man who had bought her. She only asked softly. Where to Silas did not answer right away. He tipped his hat toward a mule cart waiting beside the mercantile. She followed. The road out of town was hushed. No one called after them. The cart rattled past frozen fields and low stone fences. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt as she folded her hands in her lap, thumb rubbing against the hard skin of her palm. The land stretched wide and lonely. He asked no questions, and she offered none. By the time they reached his place, dusk had nearly settled. The fence leaned, the barn sagged on broken hinges, and the house stood plain and gray, as if it had long ago given up on color. He tied the mule, then offered his hand. She accepted, stepping down with a faint grunt. Inside, the smell was of wood smoke and old dust, No welcome, no flowers, just bare floorboards, a cold stove, and one chair pulled up to a table, set for a single man. "This is it," Silas said quietly. "I sleep in the back. You'll take this room." She nodded without question. Later. She unpacked her meager belongings, one extra dress, a patched apron, a sewing kit, a tattered book, a tin of dried lavender, and a faded photograph of two laughing little girls beside a thinner, younger version of herself. Outside. Silas sat on the porch, pipe in hand, staring at the empty hills. Martha built a small fire in the stove, boiled water, and wiped down the table without waiting to be told. That night, they ate in silence. He brought up cornbread from the cellar. She warmed beans. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. When he rose to retire, he paused at the doorway, glancing toward her. She did not meet his eyes, only sipped her tea, steam curling soft against her round cheeks. He gave a brief nod. She slept on a narrow cot in the front room, boots beside her, shawl wrapped tight. Outside, the wind howled through cracks in the window panes while coyotes cried in the distance. By morning, the town would have already forgotten her face. Only Silas would remember. Neither of them knew yet what sort of home was being built, not with bricks, but with silence and presence. The next day broke gray. Martha had risen early, in a new place. Rest never came easy. She found a tin of flour, a crock of lard, and milk soured, but still usable. By the time Silas stepped into the front room, the kitchen carried the scent of biscuits. He lingered a moment, eyes on the table where steam curled from two split biscuits, a pot of coffee, and slices of smoked meat she had found tucked away. He sat, ate quietly. She drank her coffee standing near the window. When he finished, he stood. "Gotta check the north fence. Mules out back if you need town." She nodded. "I'll see to the pantry." At the door, he hesitated. "You don't have to cook." "I know," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. Then he left. Martha worked through that first morning as though the weight of years had fallen squarely on her shoulders. She rolled her sleeves past her elbows and set to work, finding the cabin long neglected. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like lace abandoned by time. Dust lay so thick upon the shelves that her fingers left deep trails when she wiped across them. She spotted dried mud stamped into the floorboards from boots long since gone, and, in the quiet of that house, she began to sense the lives that had once filled it. There were small reminders everywhere. A ribbon tucked behind the chest of drawers, faded but still knotted as though once tied to a little girl's braid. A child's shoe, far too small for any grown man, lay hidden beneath the bed. She noticed these things, but did not question them. Instead, she filled a pot with water, set it to boil, and began scrubbing every surface she could reach. She threw open windows until the Wyoming air blew through the rooms, chasing out stale breath and letting the wind carry some of the heaviness away. By mid-afternoon, sweat clung to her back, and her hands stung with the sharp scent of pine soap. She stepped out to the porch, lowering herself onto the step, and sipped cool water while dust swirled across the yard in little spirals. For a moment she simply sat, staring at the horizon, wondering how far her life had wandered from what she once imagined. Near dusk, she saw Silas coming back from the north slope, leading the mule with his coat tugged tight against the bite of the evening. He did not wave or call out, but when he stepped inside and caught the smell of beef stew simmering on the stove, he paused as though something had caught hold of him. "I hope you eat beef," Martha said plainly. Martha, She had found a sack of potatoes hidden under the floorboard and a few onions besides. He gave a single nod. "I do." They sat at the table again, this time facing each other across the worn wood. The silence was not sharp, only steady. She watched him carefully, his shoulders bent slightly forward, his hands roughened by years of labor. After a while she asked, "You have children?" His spoon halted mid-air. His eyes stayed on the bowl. "No," he said. Then after a beat, softer, "Not anymore." She did not press. She simply passed the cornbread his way and let the quiet return. Later that evening she found an old quilt in a trunk and spread it across her cot. As she lowered the lamp, her gaze fell on the photograph tucked into her mirror's frame. Two little girls laughing beside a younger version of herself. She touched the corner of it with her thumb and whispered, "Mama's still here. Still trying." Over the days that followed, small changes slipped into the rhythm of the house. Silas carried in firewood without her asking. She mended the sleeves of his coat without a word. One morning he placed a rabbit on the counter and said, "Figured you'd know what to do with it." She nodded, and though she offered no thanks, he noticed the way she hummed as she worked, a sound gentle as river water. By week's end she had torn down the ragged curtains and sewn new ones out of an old sheet. She found a chipped cup and placed a brittle flower within it, setting it on the windowsill. That night, as she sipped tea by the fire, she said quietly, "You don't speak much. I don't need much." He replied. She nodded. "Neither do I. Still, it's good to hear a voice now and then." He looked at her across the room, his expression unreadable, then said in a tone, without embellishment, "Your voice is enough." The words hung in the dim cabin, not sweet, not tender, but steady and real. For the first time in years, Martha felt less like a burden and more like someone meant to be there, not for beauty or praise, but for usefulness, and perhaps, in time, something deeper. It was a Tuesday when everything shifted. Martha was outside tugging the last of the yellowed carrots from the stubborn ground behind the house, her apron heavy with dirt and roots, when she heard the wagon wheels. She looked up and saw Silas arriving slower than usual. 4 children sat in the back, silent and worn. The oldest, a boy of about 10, clutched the rail with white knuckles as though it kept him upright. A small girl, no more than 4, pressed her thumb to her mouth, her eyes wide and dark. Silas tied off the mule without a word. "They're from the mission house," he said at last. "No one claimed them. No one came." Martha studied the children, then glanced back at him. "What do you want done?" "They'll sleep in the loft," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I'll build bunks. I can bring more oats next week." She set the carrots aside and walked toward the wagon. The children did not speak, but neither did they pull away when she knelt before them. "Do you like stew?" she asked the boy. He blinked. She nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside. It's warm." That evening the cabin felt different. 6 bowls clattered on the table instead of 2. Martha divided the portions evenly, mashed the youngest girl's food with her fork, and tore bread into soft pieces for their small hands. Silas sat quieter than ever, as if afraid a sound might break the fragile stillness now filling the room. After supper, Martha gathered quilts from the chest and spread them in the loft. She tucked the littlest one beneath a pillowcase she had stitched long ago, its edge embroidered with blue thread. No tears came that night, only silence. When the fire burned low, Martha heard the boy whisper into the dark. "Why'd you take us?" Silas answered softly from the shadows. "Because no one else did." By morning, Martha was awake before the sun. She baked cornbread again, this time adding a pinch of sugar. The children ate hungrily, as though days had passed without such a meal. By week's end, she had written their names on scraps of paper and pinned them above their bunks. Daniel, Annie, Jonah, and Clara. She sang quietly as she worked, just enough that the smallest girl began to hum along. Jonah followed her about the house, watching her hands as she scrubbed or stirred. One afternoon she placed a wooden spoon in his hand and let him stir the stew himself. "You got kin, Miss Martha?" he asked softly by the well. She dried her hands on her apron. Had 2 sisters, both younger. They're gone now. He nodded with the solemnity of someone far older than his years. "You cook like a mama." Martha blinked, then managed a small smile. "Well, that's something, isn't it?" The talk in town shifted like wind through dry grass. First, they had laughed about the rancher who paid coin for the fat bride. Now the gossip turned toward her stew pot, the curtains she had sewn, and the orphans tucked beneath her roof. "She is trying to make a home out of scraps," one woman sneered as she adjusted her shawl outside the mercantile. Another smirked. "Well, she has the hips for it, built for breeding, if nothing else." The laughter that followed was sharp, not kind. One man did not join the jesting. Reverend Harlan, tall and solemn, rode out one Sunday afternoon and dismounted with his hat in his hands, at the McGraw place. Martha poured him tea and offered a slice of bread. The children sat politely on the porch, their hands folded neatly in their laps. "You have taken on a heavy burden," the Reverend said after a pause. Martha shook her head. "Not a burden, just hungry mouths. I was given hands, and I know how to use them." Silas said little, as he always did. Yet when the Reverend tipped his hat and rode away, Silas lingered on the porch longer than usual, watching the rider disappear over the ridge. That evening, after the children were settled in the loft and the fire burned low, Martha sat in a rocker sewing a patch onto Jonah's worn shirt. Silas stood in the doorway. His shadow stretched across the floor. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. She did not look up from her stitching. "Neither did you." He gave a single nod, slow and thoughtful. The silence that followed did not feel heavy this time. It felt shared, like a blanket pulled over 2 weary souls. The cabin that had once echoed with nothing but grief now carried muddy footprints, bursts of laughter, and the soft creak of young voices filling the empty corners. Martha no longer thought about the cruel words whispered behind her back. She was too busy darning socks and making sure 4 small bodies were kept warm through the night. That winter came early, the snow arriving first as a whisper and then as a roar. Trees bent low under its weight. The ranch shrank into itself. No more than a gray house, a sagging barn, and a thin curl of smoke rising into the frozen sky. Yet inside those walls, something new took root. Each morning Martha helped the children bundle into mismatched layers. Their mittens were pieced together from scraps, their scarves cut from flour sacks she had stitched into shape. Together they trudged out with Silas, scattering grain for the hens and shoveling narrow paths through the drifts. Their small boots crunched in the snow like steady drums. Evenings were gentler. By the glow of the fire, Martha mended what needed mending while a pot of stew simmered once more. Silas read in low tones when asked, his voice rough but steady. The children sprawled on quilts, whispering and giggling until their eyes grew heavy. But in Willow Creek, the talk did not cease. On her rare trips into town, Martha felt the weight of every glance. She went alone, bonnet tied firm under her chin, mule cart rattling along the frozen road. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Whitfield peered over the counter with a frown. 4 extra mouths out at that place. You must be growing food on prayer. Martha only smiled faintly. Flour, if you have it. At the post office, men tipped their hats, but not with respect. Their eyes slid over her, filled with disbelief and pity, some with a curl of amusement. She is playing house like it's real. One muttered, another chuckled. Fat woman just wants someone to love her. Martha did not answer. She stood steady, handed over her list, and waited until her supplies were bundled. Back at the ranch, there was no laughter at her expense. Annie often curled in her lap at night, clutching a rag doll Martha had sewn from scraps. Daniel split kindling with surprising skill for his age and tended the barn cats without prompting. Little Clara no longer hid behind the stove. She came running, cheeks rosy, hands muddy, squealing with delight when snowflakes landed on her lashes. And Jonah, quiet Jonah, had begun to draw. With a stub of charcoal, he scratched images onto scraps of paper. One afternoon, he folded a piece small and handed it shyly to Martha. She opened it to find a lopsided woman with round cheeks and a long braid, holding 4 stick figures in her arms. At the bottom, in crooked letters, he had written, Our Ma. She kept that drawing tucked into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing it when the house grew still. Sunday came, and though Silas remained behind, Martha knew the children needed the comfort of church. They bathed the night before in water warmed on the stove. She brushed each head of hair with careful patience, then put on her cleanest brown dress. In the morning, she walked to the chapel, with all 4 trailing behind, like little ducks. The pews creaked under the weight of stairs. The preacher cleared his throat again and again before beginning the service. When the time came for song, Annie, barely 6, stood up straight, her ribbon braids trembling as she sang Jesus Loves Me. Her voice was thin at first, then stronger as Martha nodded encouragement. When the last note faded, the church was silent. Then from the back, an old woman whispered a single, Amen. Outside afterward, no one laughed. They did not smile either, but their eyes lingered longer, not on Martha's waistline, but on the children. At the well, a woman stopped her. You took in all 4, yes, not your own, though they are now. The woman hesitated, then pressed something into Martha's hand, a pair of knitted mittens, too small for grown hands. Had extras. That evening Silas waited on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the trail. When Annie came running, he scooped her up without hesitation. How was church? He asked. I sang real good, she told him proudly. I bet you did. Martha approached slower, weary from the day but calm in her step. She sang like she meant it, Martha said quietly. Silas studied her, then nodded. You did good. That night, while the wind clawed at the eaves and sleet rattled against the windows, the cabin did not feel cold at all. Inside, 5 people sat around a table, passing bread and stew. When Martha reached for the loaf, her hand brushed Silas's. He did not pull away, and neither did she. Later, when she lit the lamp in the front room, she noticed something new. Along the wall near the fireplace hung 4 freshly carved wooden pegs, one for each child's coat. They had not been there yesterday. Outside, the wind moaned like a grieving voice. Sleep did not come easily to Martha that night, not from fear, but from a restless sense that something had begun to shift in the bones of that quiet house. Martha had weathered storms before, but that night she could not shake the feeling in her chest that something fragile was about to give way. Long before the first hint of dawn, she slipped from her bed, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stirred the fire back to life. In the loft above, the children slept soundly, bundled together beneath patchwork quilts she had pieced from scraps of fabric. She cracked the cabin door just enough to breathe the air outside. The cold carried a sharp edge, the kind that promised snow before the day was done. By noon, the wind cut against the skin like needles. Out in the barn, Silas braced the beams against the gale, while Daniel and Jonah hauled lumber from the shed. Martha had kept Annie and little Clara inside, their small hands busy shelling beans by the hearth. The bread had just come from the oven when she heard it a sharp crack, followed by a dull crash. Then came the smoke, thick and wrong, curling into the sky. She ran to the window, heart stopping at the sight of orange fire leaping behind the barn wall. She did not scream. She only gathered her skirts and ran. Her boots struck mud and snow, but she did not slow. Silas was already shouting, dragging Jonah away from the burning wall while Daniel stumbled out, coughing into the wind. Flames had raced across the loft, hay bales smoldering, and there at the threshold Annie. The girl had followed, her tiny arms outstretched toward the terrified horses. Annie Martha's voice broke across the wind, but the child stood frozen, unable to move. Silas lunged but slipped in the mire. Martha did not hesitate. She charged into the fire, skirts brushing flames, apron catching an ember that seared her hand before she beat it out. She scooped Annie into her arms, shielding the girl's face with her body, and turned just as the roof groaned overhead. They staggered into the yard with seconds to spare. Daniel cried out when he saw his sister in Martha's arms. Silas caught Martha before her knees gave way, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her inside, laying her gently on the bed while smoke still curled from her sleeves. Annie sobbed into Martha's skirt, gasping. "I told her not to go." "It wasn't your fault," Martha whispered, her breath ragged. "She was only frightened." Silas brought a basin of water, and Martha stripped away her outer clothes. Her arms were blistered, red with burns, but she made no sound. She pressed the cloth first to Annie's face, then to her own hands. Hours slipped past. By nightfall the barn was nearly gone. The mule had bolted. The hens scattered, but the children lived. Later, as the fire in the stove sank to embers, Silas sat on the floor beside her. Martha's hands were wrapped in clean cloth, resting in her lap. "You ran into the fire," he said softly. "I didn't think. I just moved. She calls you Ma now. I know. You didn't have to be the one to go." Her eyes, red-rimmed from smoke and tears, met his. "No, but I was the one she reached for." He had no answer. He only watched the last glow fade from the coals. Then, quietly, he set something beside her, a small carving of a woman holding a child, rough-hewn but steady. She held it close that night as she rocked Annie to sleep. By the next morning, word had traveled faster than the wind. Folks in Willow Creek repeated it over coffee and in pews, how the heavy bride had run into a burning barn, how she came back out with a child in her arms and smoke trailing from her apron. Some called her foolish, some called her brave, but no one laughed. Not anymore. At the mercantile. Mrs. Whitfield slipped extra flour into Martha's sack without charge. Someone left 2 fresh loaves at the mule cart. At church, Reverend Harlan spoke her name in prayer. At the cabin, Martha never mentioned the pain. She went on cooking, cleaning, and mending. That night Jonah slipped a new drawing onto the table. 5 figures standing before a small house. flames above them with a heart drawn through. Martha did not cry. She only touched the paper and whispered, "We're still standing." Spring crept in, slow. Snow melted first in the gullies, leaving patches of green no one had seen all winter. Buds swelled on the trees, and the frozen creek began to gurgle with runoff. Inside, rhythms shifted. The children now had chores of their own, claimed not because Martha commanded it, but because they asked. She tacked a chart beside the stove, sweeping, feeding hens, hauling wood, folding linens. It belonged to them now as much as to her. Silas rebuilt the barn with Daniel at his side. Together they hauled beams from the woods, working until dusk. Daniel's shoulders were still narrow, but his back had straightened, and he no longer startled at sudden sounds. Martha watched them through the window as she kneaded dough. Annie pressed her small fists into it too, laughing as the dough sprang back. She followed Martha everywhere, always asking when the bread would rise. By the hearth. Jonah worked with a borrowed knife, carving shapes from soft pine. Clara strung dried apples on a length of twine, humming to herself. For the first time in a long while, Martha allowed herself to smile and keep smiling. One afternoon, she found Silas on the porch, hammering something into place. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer. "What's that?" she asked. He moved aside, showing her a piece of cedar sanded smooth and nailed above the steps. 4 names had been carved into it with careful, uneven letters. Daniel, Annie, Jonah, Clara. Martha reached out, tracing her fingers across the grooves. The children crowded close behind her, watching. Silas handed her the knife. "You should add yours," he said. For a moment her hand trembled. Then she took the blade and knelt before the board. Slowly, she carved her own name beneath the children's Martha Ellen, steady as a heartbeat. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she pressed the knife into the cedar, though not from pain. The burns on her arms had mostly healed, but it was something else, something harder to name that made her fingers unsteady. She bent close, carving her name beneath the children's. Her letters came slower, more careful, but steady as a heartbeat. Martha Ellen. She left space beside it, a space that waited. That evening, the sun fell soft across the porch, painting the land in gold. The family gathered there as if by habit, drawn to the swing Silas had mended weeks earlier. Martha sat in the middle. Clara curled against her side, while Daniel and Jonah tossed pebbles toward an old tin can. Annie sat braiding clover stems, tongue between her teeth as she worked. Silas rested on the step below them, arms balanced on his knees, eyes steady on the scene. "Why haven't you carved yours yet?" Jonah asked suddenly, his young voice breaking the quiet. Silas glanced up, first at Martha, then at the children. "I've been waiting," he said slowly, "to see if it was my place." Martha reached out, laying her hand gently on his shoulder. "This has always been your house. Silas." He shook his head. "It wasn't a home until you named it. That night, when the others had gone to bed." Martha noticed the front door slightly ajar. She stepped outside, bare feet brushing cool floorboards. The name board was still there, and now, carved just beneath her own, were clean, strong letters, Silas. She stood for a long time, hand on the frame, the wind moving gently over the hills. For the first time, she let herself believe this life was hers. Days slipped into weeks, and the little ranch began to feel whole. Martha added hooks by the door, one for each child's satchel. She hung a bell by the porch, not to summon them with sharp calls, but to let them know supper was ready. The cabin no longer echoed hollow. Instead it carried laughter, song, the patter of boots racing between the barn and the well. Martha planted herbs in a window box and taught Annie their names: sage, thyme, lavender. Jonah sketched a new picture of the cabin: smoke curling from the chimney, 6 figures in the yard. "This is us," he said. She smiled, smoothing her thumb across the paper. "And who's the tall one with the big hands?" she teased. Jonah grinned. "That's him. Thought he ought to be in it now." Silas joined them one afternoon with a small bench he had built for the children. It was clumsy and rough, but strong. "Got tired of you all fighting for a place on the step," he muttered, setting it down. The children climbed onto it at once, proud as if it were made of gold. That night, Martha sat in her rocker while the children settled into their bunks. Silas lingered by the door, his voice low. "I thought you might leave after the fire." She looked up at him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "And go where I've never had my name carved into a porch before." He stepped closer, eyes softened by the lamplight. "You gave them a mother." "They gave me something to mother," she whispered back. His voice dropped so low it was almost a breath. "And me." Her smile deepened, quiet but certain. "Then you've given me something too, a place to stay." In the silence that followed, there were no more questions, only the sound of the rocker creaking, the fire cracking low, and a man standing beside a woman with scarred hands, both watching over a house that at last felt full. But the next morning Martha did not rise with the dawn. Rain tapped gently against the windows, soft and steady, soaking the soil and leaving the cabin hushed. The children woke early without fuss, as though they somehow knew. Clara tugged at Jonah's sleeve when she found the stove cold. "Why didn't Ma light the fire?" Jonah frowned and went to her door. He knocked once, then again, harder. No answer. Pushing the door open, he saw her lying beneath the quilt, one hand resting over her chest, the other curled around a folded drawing. It was his sketch, the one of the family smiling outside the barn, their names carved above the porch. Jonah did not cry. He only stood there, breath quick and shallow, as though the air itself had turned too sharp to breathe. Silas found him that way, rooted in the doorway. He crossed the room slowly, sat at the bedside, and took her hand. It was rough, marked with burns and years of work, but he held it as though it were the finest thing he had ever touched. Her face was soft, lips parted, as if she had drifted into a thought and simply never returned. Beneath her pillow lay a photograph of 2 little girls from her past, worn at the edges. Silas stayed there while Jonah fetched the others. No one spoke. Even Annie, whose voice usually filled every silence, pressed her thumb between her teeth and only stared. The next day they buried her on the hill behind the cabin, beneath the cottonwood just beginning to bud. The townsfolk came on foot, by wagon, in carriages. They came not to gawk, but out of something quieter, heavier. Mrs. Whitfield brought bread and jars of jam. Reverend Harlan walked the whole way from the church, Bible clutched to his chest. She was laid to rest in her apron, just as she had asked Silas weeks earlier. Beside the garden she never finished planning. Silas built the coffin with his own hands. Daniel helped carry it. Annie tucked the little cloth doll beneath Martha's folded arms. Jonah slipped in his last drawing. Clara clung to Silas's hand and did not let go. The preacher said little, but he did not need to. The children spoke more than any sermon could. And as the cottonwood bent softly in the spring wind, the people of Willow Creek bowed their heads, no longer laughing, no longer doubting. Daniel stood tall beside the grave, his voice steadier than his years. She came when no one else did, he said. She cooked for us, sat with us, listened when we were afraid. She never asked where we came from. She just made room. Annie tugged on Silas' sleeve, eyes wide. "Can I sing the song?" she whispered. He gave a small nod, and the little girl stepped forward, her braids brushing her shoulders. Under the wide Wyoming sky, Annie began to sing, her small voice carrying soft and sure, "Jesus loves me." The sound floated over the cottonwood branches like something sacred, and before the last note faded, more than one person in Willow Creek was wiping their eyes. They did not cry for Martha's sighs, nor for the gossip that had once followed her. They wept because, at last, they understood. Love had taken shape in a woman who never demanded it in return, who simply gave. That night, the cabin felt strange, without the rhythm of her steps, or the quiet murmur of her hands working late into the evening. Yet when Silas lit the fire, the children set the table as though she were still guiding them. No one asked who would cook. Daniel stirred the stew the way she had taught him. Annie fetched the little bundle of herbs Martha had hung to dry. Before they ate, Silas bowed his head. "Thank you," was all he said. The next morning, he stepped onto the porch with his knife. With careful strokes, he carved one final name beneath hers on the cedar board. No dates, no titles, just 3 simple letters, Ma. A week later, the children gathered smooth stones from the creek and laid them in a circle around her resting place. They pressed marigold seeds into the soil, tucked sage and lavender beside them. By midsummer, green shoots pushed through the earth, bright blossoms swaying in the wind. Small hands tended them each day, the way Martha had once tended them. Every evening, Silas sat on the porch. The children gathered close. They told the stories she had shared, the ones about courage, kindness, and second chances. And sometimes they laughed, not with cruelty, as the town once had, but with the warmth of memory like stew bubbling on the stove, like an old apron tied at the waist, like a home patched together with love. Martha Ellen Carter had come to Willow Creek unwanted, whispered about as the fat bride. Yet she became the first to be called Ma, and the one they never forgot. As we grow older, we learn that true strength rarely comes from wealth, beauty, or reputation. It is found instead in the quiet courage to love when no one expects it, to give when we ourselves feel empty, and to open our doors when others turn away. Martha Ellen Carter's story reminds us that being mocked or overlooked does not define who we are. What matters most is how we choose to respond. She could have hidden from the whispers of Willow Creek, but instead, she answered with kindness, cooking meals, mending clothes, and holding frightened children until they felt safe again. In doing so, she turned strangers into family and a lonely ranch into a home. For those of us who have lived through both laughter and loss, her story is a gentle truth. It is never too late to give meaning to our days. A simple act of care, a hand held, a meal shared, a word of comfort can echo longer than we imagine. Perhaps we cannot change how the world sees us, but like Martha, we can leave behind something greater, the memory of how we made others feel. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel. Your support